I have a long history of the negative effects of early childhood trauma on me throughout my adult life. It started early when I was in high school, and that's when I was first put on medication for anxiety, and then it just got progressively worse. They're seen as coping mechanisms now, but alcoholism, suicide attempts. I had an eating disorder. The first time I was in the hospital when I was 25 years old, I weighed about 74 pounds when I went in the hospital. Self-harm, some self-harm, sexual promiscuity when I was younger. It's affected me up until it affects me to this day. Now I still have to scold myself for seeing myself as less than. I have to remind myself that I'm capable of doing the work that I'm doing and that I deserve to be doing the work that I'm doing. Because I just grew up thinking I was lesser than.
I'm Candace, and I have 5 girls, and my now 16-year-old daughter started having some issues when she was probably 2 or 3 years old, and by the time she was 4, her behavior was really out of control.
Early childhood for me was spent, now I can form the vocabulary, reading minds. I probably, as a 3-year-old, knew more about mind behavior and cycles than anyone could ever believe for a child that age. I had to be able to read minds to know what the behavior of people around me was going to be. So my major energy was not spent in those things of childhood, but rather trying to read moods, voice tones, and so on. I would say that early childhood experience of just that, and there were many, that we would now deem pathological and damaging. I would say that beginning experience best typifies what I had to go through.
For me, the effects of early childhood trauma have played out really throughout my lifetime. And really, I guess the first thing for me was I was 10 years old and I ran away from home. I knew that I wasn't safe there, and I needed to remove myself to get away. And I remember when I was found, I remember standing in the doorway, and there were 2 police officers, a man and a woman, and the woman kneeled down to get eye level with me, and she said to me, why would you do this to your parents? You know, your family loves you. Why would you want to run away? Instead of saying to me, what's happening here that made you feel so awful that you wanted to leave home? And that difference, while I couldn't put words to it when I was 10, I knew that moment was a critical moment, but there was no way for me to express that because I wasn't given the opening to do so.
When I really first started noticing that, you know, she was different than my other, because she was my 3rd child, and she was just different. You know, she wouldn't settle like the other kids. You know, she really needed pacifier. She used a pacifier till she was about 6, because that was her soothing mechanism.
Probably the earliest signs was I started isolating at the time that I was probably in 6th grade. That's when it hit me that things weren't right at home, and that my life at home was sort of based on lies. I felt like I felt very alone, and I feel like now that that was sort of the end of my innocence.
Home, hot, my feet hot on that asphalt, running down the lane and going into the dining room, and my mother was hanging pictures, always decorating, always whatever, house beautiful. And I said, Mama, this happened, just now. And she kept on hanging. She said, oh, he did not. That therapist saying to me, the people that recover say there are two girls, two children. They are both molested as you were, sexually. One goes on, leads a healthy, happy life. The other one is prey to addiction, to mental illness, and on and on. What is the difference between those two? The first one was listened to. She was listened to and guided through a process in her behalf and believed. You see, often we are not believed. When a 4-year-old says, I feel so horrible, and they say, oh, have some Kool-Aid. 4-year-old thinks she's nuts. See, simple as that.
By the time we moved to Montana, when she was 11, she was really not doing well. Started really hallucinating and really violent, and ended up getting some police involvement for hitting her sister. And that's really what got us help, was that she got some police involvement and had to, you know, see the probation officer and things like that. But that expedited the psychiatrist and the therapist and all of that here. And, you know, to make a long story short, she ended up in acute care at the hospital several times, residential several times, and finally got an accurate diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder when she was 12.
I'm Such Vilacek, and I'm the Chief Juvenile Probation Officer for Park and Sweetgrass Counties here in Livingston, Montana. You know, typically we see kids come in somewhere around age 15. You know, we work with kids as young, unfortunately, at times as 10, and obviously we work with kids up until they turn 18. What we see is behavior. And sometimes it's really hard to get to the cause of the behavior. You know, sometimes kids come in because they have a drug ticket. Sometimes kids come in because they're skipping school. Sometimes they come in because they're running away from home. Or they're engaging in other really risky behavior, or behavior that is illegal. And a lot of times we don't know what is causing that behavior. And what we do when we work with kids informally is try to hold the kids accountable, try to make sure the community safety is being addressed, and we usually try to work in a component of restitution. But sometimes it's hard when we have a 15-year-old whose behavior is out of control to really make the connection between the behavior and what's causing the behavior. And sometimes we never get to make that connection, and sometimes through working with families and working with kids, we do understand that that behavior is based on you know, some neglect at an early age. It's based on you know, the parents being drug abusers or drug users and thereby neglecting their kids, or maybe it's because there's been a lot of violence in the home and the kid is acting out because of suffering that kind of adverse childhood experience or trauma at an early age. But I wish we knew more about the kinds of trauma that our kids go through that down the road lead to the kind of behavior. The statistics that I have heard recently is that 70% of the kids who have tickets and they come into our office, 70% of those children have some sort of mental health diagnosis. And that 20% of the kids have a serious enough diagnosis that they qualify as seriously emotionally disturbed. So the kinds of mental health diagnosis that they may have would be things like depression, bipolar, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, things like that. So that's 70%, nationally the figures are 70% of the kids that we see through the juvenile justice system have some sort of mental health diagnosis.
I am Nancy Moreland, and I work at the Institute for Educational Research and Service. We house the National Native Children's Trauma Center, Safe School Center, and Co-Teach Preschool. And my role here is as a school behavioral health specialist, but I come from the education world and the education field. I am a doctoral candidate in curriculum and instruction with an emphasis in literacy and early childhood. So my work at IRES focuses on what we're doing to support children's social emotional well-being in the context of schools. So here at the National Native Children's Trauma Center, we do a lot of work on focusing on helping people understand the impacts of trauma and child traumatic stress on children's learning and development. And so we go out and train folks in those impacts so that they can have a more trauma-focused lens when they go into working in early childhood systems and school systems and other child-serving systems. So what we know is that trauma is unique to individuals, and that one event could be considered traumatic to one person and not to another. And so for the person that it is considered traumatic, there is an impact on how we learn and develop. And sometimes we can overcome that and become stronger, better people from those experiences, and sometimes it impedes our ability to function in life and to experience things the way that we would have experienced them before. And we also know that there can be long-term effects on from child traumatic stress on the outcomes in our lives, including how easy it is to get lost in things like drug and alcohol abuse, or experience other like high-risk things in our lives because we've experienced trauma as children. So one of the things that we think about is how to help children be resilient and how to provide protective factors for them, so that when there is an experience that could be construed as traumatic, they will have skills to overcome that. That is a really big question. You could probably take 4 years of college courses and still not completely understand the pivotal role that early childhood plays in our development over time and who we become as adults. There are brain specialists and researchers that study how our brain develops, and that's just one piece of the role of early childhood, that our brain is growing at such an exponential rate when we're young children, that we're learning to do certain things, and then the pieces that we don't learn to do, our brain doesn't hold on to. We don't keep those dendrites if we don't use them. So from a very scientific perspective, it's incredibly important that we have a lot of experiences and great exposure at young ages, because we need our brains to be able to do things later on. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't go and learn things later or grow different strengths over time. The relationships that infants, toddlers, preschoolers form with their primary care providers, mostly their parents, has an incredible impact on their own sense of well-being in the future. We call it attachment, and there are a lot of components to attachment, but a child's sense of well-being stems from their primary care provider. They aren't able to self-regulate as infants. They need help regulating, and that comes, as I mentioned earlier, from the womb, from the mother, from even the sensation of walking and movement in the womb starts to give infants a sense of, I move this way, I move that way, and there's a pattern to that. There's a routine around that. I know what to expect. So some of those early things are just very basic physical sensations, help us in our early abilities to regulate. And then when we as infants and toddlers don't know how to react in a situation, or whether it's good or bad, or healthy or not healthy, healthy infants look to their parent to help them decide how they should react or respond. So if a parent smiles, the infant will smile. If the mother looks anxious or upset, the child will feel some kind of anxiety because they're asking their caregiver, what do I do in this situation? So if you think about that from those very early experiences, and then fast forward to as adults, when we're in situations where we're having to calm ourselves down or stay calm under pressure in some stressful situation, we've had a history over 20, 30, 40 years of how do I respond in this situation that came from that experience with our parents, our caregivers at the very beginning. So A stands for attachment, and the R is for regulations, our self-regulation skills, and the C in the ARC model stands for competency. And competency consists of two building blocks: executive functioning and self-development and identity. And so what that is referring to is our ability to use the cognitive skills we think about in schools. Problem solving is a big part of that, making choices, and also to understand that we have the skills that we need to accomplish things in life. So how do I feel about myself, and do I feel capable of doing these things and accomplishing these things?
How can we understand what's really going on with our kids and why they're engaging in this behavior? And rather than focusing on just let's make our kids' lives miserable so that their behavior gets in line, maybe we should be looking at what do our kids need so that they can learn that this behavior is not appropriate, and what do they need based on what's already happened to them in their lives. Because I think it's hard for people to connect the dots sometimes between a small child witnessing domestic abuse in their home and a behavior that might happen when they're 15 years old and they're angry and they're acting out. Because a lot of time passes between, age 2 and age 15, and maybe we've forgotten what happened at age 2, but it's still significant, especially if it hasn't been addressed and the child knows that they're in a safe, supportive environment today.